Welcome into the DFS Den. It's Dave Eddy here, aka Corporal Eddie on Twitter, and let's talk about wide receivers. Wide receivers is kind of where I think the key to MME really lies because I try to play it pretty safe at running back. Don't get too crazy there, but the wide receiver is where I really try to gain leverage against the field, and I think that that's where you can do the same thing. Now, wide receiver is a very volatile position, which again is why I think that, if that's where you're focused, that's where you can really, make a difference in your lineup compared to others. Now, a 10-game sample size is most ideal, and that's huge because if you were to go off of that, that would literally mean you'd be waiting until the 11th week until you have enough of a sample size to feel comfortable with the stats you're looking at. So we kind of have a way to kind of get around that, if you will, and cheat. And maybe this is more so, the way that I actually end up going. And I would say that, in as little as 3 games, you can get stats that you can somewhat rely on. Now, the most predictive metrics for wide receivers come from target share, targets, receptions, and yards. Now, all of that seems relatively obvious, but needs to be said. You can get target share sample size that you can trust to some extent in as little as 3 games. Now, the receptions and the yards, those kind of fall right along the lines of, target share and targets. But I always point out to people that I think that target share is more important than targets. And people would argue to say, yeah, but there's a big difference between getting 15 targets and getting 10. And I would agree, but the target share percentage is going to fluctuate the targets based on whatever the volume would happen to be. So if a guy's getting 20%, target share, I like that a lot better than another guy who's getting 15. But even though the 15% guy might have gotten more total targets over the course of a sample size. And that's just simply because, when that team that, the guy's got the 20% target share, when they need to throw the ball more, then that guy's going to get much more targets than the guy at the 15%. So I hope that makes sense to you. But this moral of the story here, I prefer target share over targets, but both do have an importance there. So the wide receiver in the flex position is something that I like to do in MME, be it small field or large field. And it comes down to a variety of reasons. The main one is, again, it's much easier to get contrarian and to gain some leverage with wide receivers than you can with running backs. There's just many more viable options that you can roster. And usually, you do have to pay down quite a bit in the flex position for whoever that you're going to use. And in this case, like I said, it's usually a wide receiver for me. Now, typically in, tournament winning lineups, the flex is averaging about a $4,000 player at about 4% ownership. And that works in a lot of ways for us, because if you watch the strategy video where we're talking about gaining leverage, in a small field MME tournament, I'm saying you need at least 3 players under 10%. And probably 1, if not 2 of those are going to be wide receivers. In a large field, so 5,000 or more players, you're going to need 5 players that are under 10%. Now, not a hard and fast rule on these, but roughly 5. You probably are going to expect that at least 3 of those are going to be receivers. And then I even say, going a step further and saying 1 player under 3%. Now, more than likely, that is going to be your wide receiver. Granted, yes, it could be a defense. It could be a quarterback. Could be your tight end. Almost certainly not going to be your running back. That just is a recipe for disaster. But wide receiver is more than likely where that's going to come from. So those are things that you got to think about with the wide receiver position. Probably the most obvious one here is that your wide receiver should have good correlation with the rest of your lineup. When you are, choosing your quarterback, you really should be choosing that quarterback, keeping in mind who the wide receiver that you're going to stack with him is. Now, of course, you don't have to stack a quarterback with a wide receiver. A tight end can work fine. A running back to a lesser extent, but it's certainly possible. And then for your game stack, you're going to want a run back. Typically, your run back is also a wide receiver. So a game stack typically looks like quarterback with one of his pass catchers, and then a wide receiver on the other side of that. And then for secondary correlation within the lineup, again, a lot of times it's wide receiver, wide receiver. So you can, that's how you get your 4 receivers in a lineup using the flex spot. Typically, that's usually the way that it makes the most sense. And again, it's the easiest to get contrarian with a wide receiver because there are so many that are being played. One thing that I will point out as well for wide receiver is quite often whenever I'm doing a game stack, I am looking for wide receiver 2s that make sense because they're usually a little less owned than the wide receiver 1. So you're going to be a little bit more unique. And the correlation between the quarterback and the wide receiver 2 and a quarterback and his wide receiver 1 are pretty close. Obviously, the wide receiver 1 is a little bit more highly correlated, but the wide receiver 2 oftentimes is pretty close to in line with that. So some things to consider at the wide receiver position. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. If you have not done so yet, pop on over here, subscribe to the Fantasy Six Pack channel. When you do so, turn on notifications so you get an alert every time a new video comes out, and drop a like on this video if you've enjoyed it or if you've been enjoying any of these strategy videos, and we'll see you next time.